don't do that a lot around here, so aloha. Aloha. All right, I hope you've been enjoying being led in worship together with Hula Kalani, right? Something like that? Kalani. Can't believe I'm not sure how to get that together. I really do. I look forward to this every year when you guys come and we get to have a special time of worship together. We really do serve a God who loves variety. I mean, He created variety, and sometimes we get stuck in ruts. We just sort of do the same thing over and over, and we lose that variety that God so much cherishes. And so I'm glad to have you guys here and get to enjoy some of that again. Now, I don't know anyone who doesn't dream of going to Hawaii someday. How it works for you guys or not, but we always had that dream in our family. We're like, man, one day we're going to get to go to Hawaii. We're going to do that. It's kind of like this super vacation. You kind of think about it. We finally got to go last year. We had a great time. But most people, either they have a great time or they're looking forward to it, or they've already been. Part of what draws us to this tropical island paradise is the idea of escaping our troubles, right? We're going to leave it all behind. We're going to go sit on those wonderful paradise beaches. We're going to get away from all of our troubles. We're going to enjoy this glimpse of heaven. But it only lasts for a little while, and then we got to get back home. And we're back to all the troubles. Everything's always the same way again. And I was always, when we were there, I was sort of wondering, who are those guys that live there? I mean, they live in paradise. And the place that we're wanting to go to is, where do they go to escape their troubles? I mean, they're already in paradise, so how is that going to work? Thank you, Mark.
Read you for a stiffer one.
Okay. All right. Do I need a new mic too? He said I might have to come up close and personal to you. I don't know if you want me in your face that way. So we'll try to keep back up here again. But as we sort of get away from, wondering, I'm not going to say wondering about where do they escape their troubles to, because, I mean, where do you go? I guess they could go down to Easy Street. The world's answer is kind of like, if you have troubles, just go to Easy Street. Go where everything is great, you don't have any troubles, everything is fine. And so I did like any modern person would do. I got out my phone and I checked out where Easy Street was, and guess where it's at? It's in Hawaii. You can go and you can find Easy Street in Hawaii. All you have to do is put it in your phone, get it, and travel there. You have to go to Honolulu. And then you have to take the Poly Highway northbound for a while, travel about a third of the way to Poly Pass, then you take a right turn on Park Street. You go about 1 block and you'll find this sign that says Easy Street. I mean, it's there. You can go to Easy Street in Honolulu. The problem is that when you get to the street, and you can check it out on Google Maps, and you go about a block down the road, you'll run into this sign that says, dead end. I'm just saying, it's usually when we run into some obstacle, some dead end, that's when life gets interesting. That's whenever we start figuring out, how are we going to get past this? How are we going to get to where we want to go to get over this obstacle that stands in our way? We have to figure out how we're going to go over it, around it, under it, some way we're going to have to get by it. And while navigating an actual obstacle course can be a lot of fun for the physically fit, think American Ninja Warrior, it can also be a lot of fun watching someone go through an obstacle course as entertainment without having to be physically fit. It's never wonderful to go through the obstacles of life, the things that we run into. It's not an entertainment, it's not an exercise, it's not anything that we really want to do, but we face these obstacles that are challenging for us. And so in this sermon series, we're going to go through a number of those obstacles. And the obstacle that we're looking at today is the obstacle of God's judgment. I know that we don't always like sermons about judgment, but it's an obstacle, isn't it? As I shared in the community message last week, You can follow any path you want, whether it's religious or secular, and you're going to end up at the throne of God. But it's going to be his judgment throne. And there's only one path that exceeds on beyond it into the paradise that we all long for. And so, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the end of the book, God is going to judge everyone by the same standard on that day that we stand before him. We're all going to be held accountable. And Jesus said, we're even going to be accountable for every careless word that we say. I don't know how it is in your life, but I know that I haven't lived well enough to be granted welcome into heaven. I've said a couple of careless words. I've had a couple of careless actions. In fact, there's some of them that were more than just careless. Careless implies that I really didn't know what I was doing, just accidentally did it. Man, there are some things I have done intentionally and on purpose. And they sort of disqualify me. I'm not going to be able to go past God's judgment. I'm going to get there, and I'm going to get what's coming for me. When I consider that it's God who's standing in my way of heaven, I mean, I want to get there. He's the obstacle. I mean, how do you get around God? I mean, I could say maybe he doesn't really exist. Maybe he wasn't really serious. Maybe I'll do it like an end around, but he's just so powerful. He's all-knowing. He's just too big to get around. And so how do we navigate? How do we get around this obstacle of God's Son? Well, of course, we know the answer because we're here in church. Because we know that answer, he's provided us a doorway through his judgment that's in his one and only Son, Jesus. And so I want you to keep that in mind while we talk about what I think is the very best story in the Bible concerning the obstacle of God's judgment, and that is Noah and the ark. Before we begin talking about this story, I want to warn you. This is not the children's story that you've heard growing up. In fact, Noah and the ark is really not suitable for children at all. It's a story about God's judgment, even though we have this tendency to decorate our children's rooms with motifs from the story. I mean, we did it for our children when they little. I mean, we sort of do that because, who doesn't like the good vibrations that come from the image of this boat overflowing with animals everywhere? They're bobbing along in the sea. They got this beautiful sky, and there's this rainbow that's up there. I mean, it seems beautiful and wonderful and peaceful. I don't know of any parent who would ever paint next to those motifs on their children's walls the scripture that we had read earlier today, which comes from that story. Just think of the little children's room and all those wonderful things, and then you write on it, God was sorry that he had made Adam. And we just don't put that there. We don't put, and so God decided to wipe him out with the flood and all of the animals. Now, some parents of teenagers might put that on the wall, but when they're just these little innocent babies, we wouldn't do that. We might write something like, God keeps his promises. We just refrain from saying that one of those promises is to judge the world. But just so you don't misunderstand what the Bible records about these words that we read earlier together, the Hebrew word that's translated into English as sorry, in that God is sorry that he made Adam, that is humanity. It also gets brought into English as regret and pity and relent and change and console and repent and mourn and rest. But about half of the time where it shows up in the Old Testament, it gets translated comfort. Even those Psalms where it says God is our comfort, it's the same word that gets translated sorry in our text, which means that God was sorry that he had made man in the sense of being sad about it. We hear a little bit more in this verse that we read that it was a sadness that led God to be grieved in his heart over man. When we grieve, we're emoting because we've lost something that we love. We lost something that we care for. And because we've lost it, we hurt on the inside. We're sad. And that's what God said. He said he's sad because of man that he had made. You remember how God made man? If you go back a few chapters in Genesis, he made Adam in his own image, male and female. He made them. They were the crown of God's creation. He said that what he made in man was good. And for the female side of man, he said, very good. We discover in this creation story that God had made man for a purpose. God wanted companionship. He made man so that he could walk with him and he could spend life with him and he could enjoy him. They were to sort of live life in the paradise of the Garden of Eden. It was a place where there were no troubles because there wasn't any sin yet. They didn't struggle with the things that we struggle with today. It was God's hope that man would use his sort of God-given abilities to make choices that would continue to enhance that relationship. But we know the rest of the story, right? That's not how things turned out. Man made choices from his desire to be independent, deciding for himself what was really right and wrong, that led him further and further away from God until there was little, if any, relationship. And God was sad about that. He wanted a relationship with us. You should be able to understand that kind of sadness. It's the sort of sadness that the father of the prodigal son must have felt whenever his son said, hey, Dad, I can't live at your house anymore. I mean, it's just not where I want to live my life. I can't do the things that I want to do. And so he takes all his possessions and he leaves. And he goes to live the way he wants to live. And we kind of like that story because, man, the prodigal father is kind of like super father, right? He just waits and he loves and he's patient and he's caring. Even though his son is wandering and rebellious, he's just waiting for him and hoping for him to return. This is a story that Jesus told to tell us about God and his nature. It can be found in the 15th chapter of Luke. It's to emphasize that God is really in the business of finding lost things, and in particular, lost people. He's hoping for him to come back, hoping for a better life. And that's what the son does. But while the son is off in the far country, we are not told that God is like, you know what, I am tired of the prodigal son, and so I'm just going to wipe him off the face of the earth and everyone around me. That's not part of that story, right? And so we're like, man, is this like a different God? Is the God of the New Testament different than the God of the Old Testament? Because it seems like he's reacting differently. There's no denying that God's stated solution to man's wandering ways in Noah's story is to blot him out, and he uses those words, from the face of the earth, along with all the animals. And you're like, man, I'm going like, man, what do the animals do? It might interest you that the Hebrew word that's translated blot means to clean off something with a wiping motion. That's what blot means in Hebrew that gets brought into the English. It's just sort of to clean stuff off. You probably have cleaned things off before. One of the examples where this word is used is in reference to a king of Israel named Manasseh. Manasseh is referred to as a wicked king, sort of the same way these people in Noah's day are described. That is, they didn't live by God's standard. They didn't live his ways. They sought their own ways of doing things. And after his reign, we're told that God would wipe clean Jerusalem like a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down to cleanse it, so that his people could begin a new chapter in following him. And it is what God did. We'll just say, instead of getting into that story, that those who didn't follow God and make those changes, things didn't go well for them in Manasseh's day. But it should, at least hearing that kind of story, should make you wonder, just how does God clean up an evil mess? I mean, you know how you clean up messes, right? If there's some mess, you gotta start wiping and cleaning it up. And back in Genesis, in the 5th verse, It indicates that all those who turned away from their relationship with God had become wholly focused on evil. They thought that doing evil would bring them happiness. They thought that would take them into their paradise kind of living. They thought that they would get them away from their troubles. And it is exactly the kind of thing that Satan said would happen if they followed those ways. Of course, Satan's not known for telling the truth. And so these people end up being further and further away from God. They wanted even to embrace the evil things and call them good. We're told that God is going to do something about it. So not even Noah is able to stand against God's cleaning up. We're told that God considered Noah righteous, so he saw that he was sort of doing the right kinds of things. We know that Noah wasn't a perfect man. Those really don't exist. But he at least someone who remembered God. He was someone who held on to his relationship with God, and God valued that companionship. And so God said, hey, I'm going to help you out here. But even being considered righteous, Noah wouldn't have withstood the flood of God's judgment. How could he, much less anyone else, survive a flood of judgment? Truth is that Noah would not have survived if it wasn't for God's mercy. God's mercy can be seen in the fact that God didn't just bring this flood on them unannounced. Noah was told about the coming flood, and he was told to tell everyone else about the coming flood. He was told why it was coming and what they needed to do to change. And then God said, hey, I want you to build this ark. I don't know if it had outriggers on it, but there's some reason they got a boat instead of a surfboard. But, he said, hey, this is the way you're going to make it through the flood. I mean, it's going to be like for 40 days this flood is coming. And make sure that the message got out. God gives Noah 100 years to share the message of the coming flood. And the only conversions he gets is just his immediate family. His family gets saved. No one else. 100 years. I don't know how you judge preachers, but if you had a preacher who preached for 100 years and you got no one else coming to church, they might not have a job for long. But Noah, he gets 100 years of preaching. During that time, he's also doing what God tells him to do. He's building this big boat. Noah's faith in God's plan to survive the coming flood of his judgment is evidence in his actually building the ark, even though it may have taken him 100 years. He didn't just think about it. It wasn't some symbolic gesture of some inward thing that was going on. He actually trusted God enough to let it evidence in his behavior, his obedience. It was intentional obedience to God's command that expressed his faith. That's how the boat got built, is because Noah obeyed. Now, I'm sure that you recall once that Jesus told a story about a storm that brought about flooding. It wasn't a worldwide kind of flood. It was just a local flood, but it was going to be bad enough that it was going to sweep away houses and all kinds of things. Jesus said, hey, there's going to be these kinds of storms in your life, and you need to be ready. And the way you can be ready is by building your house on a rock as opposed to the sand. Because when the storm comes and the floods rise, the ones on the sand are going to get washed away. The other ones are going to stand firm. And he told that story at the end of his Sermon on the Mount. In the application, Jesus even gave the application. He says, you know what the difference between the wise man and the foolish man is? The wise man who builds his house on the rock and the foolish man who builds his house in the sand? The wise man hears my words and puts it into practice. It's not the wise man hears my words and believes me, but the one whose belief gets evidenced in obedience. There's that part of the message that we're uncomfortable with. That we've got to take what we believe and let it take root in our lives so that our behaviors become obedient to God. Faithful obedience to God's commands is really vital. It really is important. It's the way we express our faith, and it's what's going to see us through the obstacle of God's judgment. But let me remind you that our obedience doesn't earn the right to get past it. God is not going to look at you and say, you've been so obedient. You've been so good. You've been so nice, but just come on right in. You've done what I wanted you to do. You earned, in fact, I couldn't stand in your way. You've been so good. You just get right on by me. He's going to say to everyone, hey, I'm sorry, but there is no getting past me. There's no way. But we do hear those stories that give us hope. We know that there are going to be those guys who show up, and God, the obstacle is in the way, and he says, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your rest, which I prepared for you. You might recall that's what Jesus said when he was talking about the judgments found in Matthew 25. God is imaged as a shepherd who's separating the nations like a shepherd separates sheep and goats. And the righteous ones, that is, ones who are being obedient to him, are the ones who put his commands into practice. They are the ones who feed the hungry, and they're the ones who give drink to the thirsty. They're the ones who give visitation to the sick and those who are in prison. They're the ones who give clothing who don't have clothing. You kind of get the idea of what they're doing. These are people who are loving on others, who are helping with their needs. God love. He wants us, when we obey his commands, to be people of love. But there are going to be some people who show up there and they're going to say, hey, God, I've been sitting in church. I've been calling you Lord. I've been singing these really cool praise songs. We even had the hula ministry here, Lord. I mean, come on. And he's going to say, and who are you again? Hey, God, I'm a believer. He's like, depart from me, the cursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels, because you didn't do. There has to be a connection between our faith and our doing. God's commands directs us to express his love. Love for ourselves, love for our families, love for everyone we meet along the way. Obedience to God's commands are how we are supposed to express our trust that he's our God and he's leading us the right way. And it's his mercy that sees us through that final judgment when we stand before him. But what about all those people in the Noah's Ark day? What part of that story, that those people who don't get on the ark? This sort of came to me. I was looking at a Bible that was called the Lego Bible. Its nice version is this guy who's tried to use Legos and make pictures of all of the great Bible scenes. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. I love Legos. This is going to be great. And I opened up, one of the stories is Noah in the Ark. And it shows this really cool Lego ark. It's got all the animals on it, and like Noah, and everything's going on there. And then the rest of it is like this big blue, the little flat ones back there. And they have like little Lego arms and legs, like a little head over here, a little foot over there. And I'm going like, oh yeah, this is a story about judgment. What about those guys in God's judgment? I mean, wasn't it a little harsh for God to just kill everyone? Was God being unjust? Was he overreacting? I've heard some people who say, hey, this language that we read in the Old Testament is kind of parental language. It's kind of like a parent who gets mad at their kids and they say, if you don't obey, I'm going to tie you to the roof of the car for the rest of the trip. A parent wouldn't rather tie their kid on the roof of the car. And they say, look, this is really just parental language. Like, newsflash, God is the Father, but God's serious. It's not just parental language. Death is going to be coming for all those who sin. But we hear the rest of the story, not back in Genesis. We hear the rest of the story in Peter's letter. Peter writes this letter to the churches because they're wondering about God's judgment as well. And in the 3rd chapter, Peter reveals that when Jesus died, he went and preached the good news to the souls in prison who died in the days of Noah. I didn't know if you've read that before. That's sort of the rest of the story. All these guys who died under God's judgment, Jesus goes to them and he preaches to them when they're in prison. I don't know how they responded. We aren't told. All these people who rejected Noah for 100 years, did they reject Jesus' message? I don't know. I think circumstances have changed. I can't imagine any of them rejecting that message at that point with that experience. We aren't told what's happened. But we are given this insight that God is gracious and God is merciful and God gives opportunity to respond to what he's done. Yes, he's the obstacle, but man, the door of Jesus is large and present and presented to us. And then Peter does something that gets a lot of people a little uncomfortable, depending on their theology. Peter compares our obedience to being baptized to Noah's obedience to build an ark. He actually says that baptism now saves us in the same way that the ark saved Noah and his family. And there are a lot of people who are going like, Peter, why did you say that? That's bad theology, Peter. Didn't you listen to the faith-only guy? I mean, you're ruining it. He says in that letter, Peter, it saves us not because it wipes the dirt off the body. It doesn't just blot it out in that sense. He says it saves us because it's our request to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's sort of that first obedience. It's the first way we express our faith to God. It's not the last obedience, but it's that first obedience, our first step in letting our faith express itself in an obedience to the command that he actually gave to us. You know, Jesus did say we're supposed to make disciples by baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit and teaching them to obey all of his commands. It's usually at this point in the conversation, if I'm talking to someone, they'll say something like, well, but what about the thief on the cross? They didn't get baptized. They didn't obey Jesus. It's just symbolic stuff. You don't have to actually do it. You just have to think it in your head. Right? Well, granted, man, that thief was talking to Jesus on the cross. And if you find yourself in the same situation, go for it. If you just happen to be on a cross next to Jesus and there is no opportunity for you to be obedient, I mean, I'm sure God is going to be gracious. But what if you have the opportunity? What if you have the time? And what if you said, you know, God, I don't think you're serious about this. It doesn't make any sense. It's just a symbol. It's really a meaningless thing, God, and I don't have to do it. I mean, you can take that up with God. Our faith is expressed in obedience, whether we understand it or not. It's not about earning. It's about trusting. It's about letting that trust in our lives be evidence and doing things what God tells us to do because he told us to do it, and it is the right way. The Bible is clear about our obedience. In fact, James had to talk to the early church, and he had to actually tell them, hey man, you let your faith be evidenced in your words, but I'm going to let my faith be evidenced in my actions. And the actions he was talking about were taking care of people who needed help. Because the church had a problem back then. They were saying, oh man, I love Jesus, but they weren't actually letting that express itself in obedience actions of love. And James says, man, you got to get past it. So that you actually do what God calls you to do. Which means there's good news. We do face this huge flood of God's judgment. And there was this song when I was a kid growing up that says, man, it's so big you can't get around it, you can't get under it, you can't go around it, you got to go through the door. And Jesus says, I'm the door. Come on in. There's room on the ark for you. I know the old one, there was only 8 people that got on. But man, there's room for you to get on now. The door is open. Time is present. And God is waiting for you to get on. The rainbow. I hate, right now, people get to the rainbow and they're like, oh, that's a representation of God's, all the variety, and we have all this stuff going on with the rainbow. But man, the rainbow is such a beautiful thing. And it is a reminder of a promise. It's the reminder of a promise that God is not going to destroy the world again by water. It's not a promise that he isn't going to destroy the world. He's going to do it with fire. But we won't have to worry about it either way. Because we're going to be on that ark. And we're going to be a part of that family that God has created in those who follow Jesus. And we are going to get carried past the judgment of God into the paradise that he wants us to. So if you're looking to catch a wave, man, make sure you're on the ark that God has provided you. It's the only way through. We're going to have a hymn, a song of a time. If you're thinking that, man, I'm ready for a first step, today's a great day for a first step. Or maybe it's a time to talk to someone. If you want to know more about following Jesus, we have a lot of people in our church who would love to visit with you. Would you please stand?